Trucks have gotten too damn big, and making the giant truck electric is not solving the problem. We developed battery and safety technology that actually lets us solve this problem. Telo Trucks is building an electric crew cab pickup truck, the same capabilities as a mid-sized truck in half the space.
Your trusted source for information on the energy transition. This is the Insider's Guide to Energy podcast. Hello, Energy Leader. This is Chris Sass, host of the Insider's Guide to Energy, and I asked for just a few moments of your time to make you aware of a brand new program that I think you'll be excited about. The program is called Podcast Power, Media Training for Energy Leaders. You're probably already aware that podcasts are a dominant force in the media today. As an executive in the energy space, you are often asked to be a guest on a podcast, and your legacy media training leaves a lot of gaps in the skills you need to be successful on a podcast. Common sense doesn't always do it. And to avoid these pitfalls, Insider's Guide to Energy has partnered with the Antenna Group and their media trainers to create a hands-on interactive 2-day workshop designed for executives in the energy and clean tech space specifically. You'll get all the skills you need to have successful interviews and to reach the audience you intend to reach. So whether you're reaching out to customers, future employees, or investors, this is the class for you. Space is limited to the first 10, and those that are selected will get the opportunity to be a guest on the Insider's Guide to Energy, practicing your new skills. Welcome to another edition of the Insider's Guide to Energy EV. And with me is my co-host, Neil Rydell. Neil, what are we talking about today?
So I need to introduce this one particularly carefully because we're talking about trucks. But being British, that doesn't necessarily mean big trucks. That also means mini trucks. So we're here to talk with Jason Marks and Forrest North of Telo Trucks about the product that they're bringing to market. Hey guys, can you tell us a bit more about what you're doing?
Yeah, thanks for having us. Appreciate that. So Telo Trucks builds electric mini trucks. So a pickup truck with all the capability of a full-size truck that's built into the footprint of a two-door Mini Cooper. Really, we're trying to make it accessible for people to use trucks, both for commercial purposes and for recreational purposes, that live in dense urban populations.
So this is something that clearly Americans are hugely in love with, big vehicles to move around through cities, across towns and the massive countryside you guys have got on quite broad, wide roads. And from what we've seen in past history of vehicles are getting bigger all the time. How are you expecting people to respond to this transition?
Well, I think you have to kind of look at the reason why vehicles have gotten so gigantic over the last 15 to 20 years. So people assume that there's this American feeling of whatever you have it, either it's masculinity or anything like that, that shows that why vehicles have gotten so much larger. But that's actually not the whole truth. Sure, there's plenty of people that do love their giant raised vehicles with 46-inch tires, but there's actually incentives for the automakers to build vehicles larger and larger every year. And that doesn't necessarily align with the American consumer and what they actually want. So, if we look at actually the regulation that's passed over the last 20 years, both in safety regulations and for environmental regulations, it's really given automakers really no other option but to build their vehicles substantially larger every single year. And I'm sure we'll dive into the details of that shortly.
So you're talking about a vehicle that you said fits in a smaller footprint. Neil talked about our massive trucks. I see, for those of you watching the YouTube, you can see a picture of a truck behind you, and it's a 4-door truck. Pickup truck looks like a standard truck. What size bed do these have, though? If it's a small footprint like that, are these 4-foot beds, 6-foot beds? How big is the bed?
Yeah, so the bed in this vehicle you're seeing behind us, the one that we're bringing to market, is 5 feet long. It's a full 5-foot bed, 60 inches. Now, one of the beautiful things we designed into our vehicle is a true midgate that folds completely flat, where the second row of seats folds all the way flat. So you get that additional space, which is almost 3 additional feet of extra bed space. So you can fit a 4x8 sheet of plywood. And that actually does a lot of interesting use cases. If you're a surfer, of course, as long as you have like a tonneau cover that covers the bed, you can put your full surfboard in there and lock it up and nobody can access it. And if you're a camper or you like to be out in the wilderness, it's a great way to have a full-size bed that you can lay flat in there and sleep in while not having to worry about pulling the tailgate down, having a cover in the back of the tailgate.
But hasn't that concept already been tried with things like the Avalanche and some other products that probably aren't with us anymore?
Well, I mean, if we're going to talk about, it's actually on vehicles today as well, including new vehicles that are coming out. that have just been released recently. So it's not necessarily a new concept. And if you talk to people that have it, they generally love it.
Awesome.
So
Yeah.
the key thing that interests me at this stage is you're bringing this to market as an electric vehicle. What's the status of bringing electric vehicles to market today? I mean, we've seen some quite high profile businesses struggle in the current market. Why do you think now is a good time to bring an electric mini truck to market?
I think now's an awesome actually time to be developing and getting ready to deliver vehicles as we climb up the trough to disillusionment in the hype cycle of a product delivery. But I mean, let me kind of break that question down into two things. There's a graveyard of electric vehicle companies that have kind of come before us over the last 10 years or so. A lot of things that are common amongst them is they've taken an existing vehicle platform and said, we're going to build that, but make it electric. And I don't think that's really the right mentality to have when you're trying to bring something new to market. If you look at how the automobile became popularized in the early 1900s, it used to be that the first ever automobiles were just horse-drawn carriages with an engine in them. And it was this one box horse-drawn carriage with an engine in it. And it slowly transitioned to this two-box solution with this big motor in the front. And that's what it remained for the last 120 years, right? We're at this really unique standpoint where we no longer need this two-box solution to actually solve all the problems of an automobile. So I think that everyone that's kind of taken what's been true of the internal combustion engine and trying to apply it to electric vehicles are just giving people something that's markedly worse in many ways without actually capitalizing on the advantage of electrification. So a core to what we do is actually capitalizing on the advantage of electrification that lets us build our solution like a one-box solution and actually make it into the footprint that's useful in many ways. So that's one thing that we're doing differently. We're building our vehicle completely differently than the people that came before us. But on top of that, building a vehicle company is very challenging, as you've seen. People like to tout that it costs $1 billion to build an electric vehicle company. It's extremely capital intensive. But a lot of that means that we're looking at what it takes to build a high volume manufacturing capability in a vehicle company. What we've looked at is what does it take to build a profitable vehicle company as quickly as possible, which means that how do we get to profitability at the low and mid volumes of vehicle development? And a lot of our decisions, and even what's been possible, has only actually been possible because of the last 5 years of what's kind of rolled out. So 3 major things allow us to actually build a vehicle company. Right now, it's different than any time before. One, we have a mature supply chain for a lot of the components that don't differentiate our vehicles. So that's like the drivetrain, completely off the shelf, things like the interior components, glass, all that can be made completely off the shelf that we don't have to design from scratch ourselves. The only thing we innovate in is the word innovation matters, and that's the battery pack and the safety system of our vehicle. The second thing is manufacturing capabilities. So we can do low and mid volume contract manufacturing, and you can amortize the cost of manufacturing amongst many different automakers. And that's made it possible to build medium volume, profitable EV companies. And the biggest thing that's really different right now is software. So software has enabled us to not only develop components of the vehicle as a software-defined vehicle, but also to validate our vehicle virtually completely. So a lot of automobile companies before, they built hundreds of prototypes to do, and breadboards they call them, which is the vehicle just on a table. And that costs so much money and so many hours of labor to actually do the validation process of the vehicle. We've already crashed our vehicle in software 100 times. We've done things like electrical validation. We've done structural validation, vibration analysis, suspension kinematics. All that can be done virtually now. And you can build very few prototypes to actually verify that your validation is good.
So I get that the cost structure and building profitability is good, but the market was pretty rough for new entrants into the market. So are we past that stage? Are people funding and looking to be engaged in bringing new concepts to market then?
Well, I think that comes down to, we've seen electric vehicles have like a lot of negative news in the past. And there's a bunch of different reasons for that negative news. I think that one of the things is there's a lot of resistance in the market for the incumbent players to have new entrants come in. So they're really pushing hard to prevent that hype cycle from peaking for the new entrants. But I think that people are just looking for something different, not the amorphous blob that is the general crossover in the world. It doesn't really differentiate on anything specifically. They're looking for actually use in their vehicles. How am I going to particularly use my vehicle? So I think that because we position ourselves as something unique and different in that case, we're able to get a lot of interest in that way.
And what about go-to-market? I think Tesla disrupted with their go-to-market strategy. It didn't necessarily pan out well for others that tried to emulate that. And the dealership kind of structure we have in North America, how do you guys handle that?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's funny. If you talk to a lot of people that have worked in this space over the last 5 years, they were very gung ho on no dealers, never ever will go directly to consumers, and then they've kind of backtracked a little bit on that and said, hey, the finances were interesting and didn't really work out that well. So we're actually, we kind of bifurcate our solutions into when we're selling to consumers versus selling to commercial applications. And I'll talk on the commercial, and Forrest can talk on the consumer. But on the commercial side of things, it's really unique in that there's two different buckets of commercial fleet customers. There's the bucket of the actual fleets where you have a fleet identification number and you can buy directly from the automakers themselves, which is really the big names in the world. And then there's the bucket of the commercial customers that don't have a fleet identification number, but they buy maybe up to 10 vehicles every year. But they have to go in person to a dealership, get their background check every single time they buy a new vehicle. And the go-to-market strategy is different for those two in and of itself. So if you're a fleet identification customer, we can go direct to you. You can finance it yourself. You have the mechanism and capabilities to do that. It's actually relatively straightforward, but we have to establish ourselves as a pretty big player to actually support them. On the commercial side, we still need a mechanism for which they can apply financing to actually get their vehicles in-house. And we're evaluating a couple of unique opportunities.
I think you've kind of covered it. I did want to kind of go back to your earlier question just on the timing of when you start. And, a lot of the automakers that have succeeded actually started in downturns. And the ones that started in these times of like free money didn't do so well. So that is something that's interesting that we watch. And I think, at least from my experience, part of that is when you start in a downturn, you make decisions that are, you're in lean times and you're making really kind of practical, logical decisions as opposed to just like throwing hundreds of millions of dollars around. So I think that ends up making a better product. As far as reaching consumers, right now we have more tools available to reach consumers than any time before. So right now we're having a good influx of consumers coming directly to us. We're still working on the go-to-market plans as far as whether we work with franchised dealerships or how we do that. But it is really important to have service and distribution. So that's probably the direction that we're going to go is through larger franchised dealer groups.
And when we were introducing what you're doing, you identified two really important USPs to you guys. One of them was battery tech. The other one was safety. Can you open them up a bit more for us and tell us what you're doing that's different in that space and why and how you're introducing it to the Telo truck?
Yeah, our battery tech is this is like my sixth now generation of battery pack. So a lot of what makes a good battery pack is understanding just the fundamentals, what's possible, in kind of holistic design, right? So I can't like maybe point to any one specific parameter that makes us better than everyone else. But one of the things we've focused on is the vertical height of the battery pack, because any vertical height of the battery pack essentially translates into the vertical height of the roof, which then it creates more aero drag. So that's been one focus. The other is in energy density and bringing that energy density kind of more to the central part of the pack. So we have really good protection against collision and ingress from the sides or the tail side of the battery. Everything is cooled, liquid cooled. We have both active and passive mechanisms for keeping the pack very homeostasis, essentially, like keeping everything isothermal. And we also fuse every cell. So there are other companies that do that, but some of the large companies don't, which I actually think is crazy.
I have a question based on what you're saying on batteries. Is there a minimum viable product for range for a new vehicle? Is the expectation changed from the early days of, let's say, a Leaf or something like that to what I should expect if I look at one of your trucks for either commercial application for a fleet or individually?
I think it might be different for fleet, but for me personally, from what I've seen in the market and what I kind of grew up with working at a large OEM that we won't mention here, but is that you really want to be over 300 miles of range. And the benefit is that once you're over 300 miles of range, you have so much battery capacity, you can use energy cells, which gets you that high energy density. But because you have so many cells, you can actually have crazy performance because you have a lot of cells that you can draw a little bit of current from. And then what the other nice thing about that is that people don't actually drive the full range of the vehicle every day. And so there's a benefit to having these kind of very small, most people drive 20 miles a day around that, which is about 8 kilowatt hours. So you have a 100 kilowatt hour pack and you're mostly drawing 8 kilowatt hours a day on average. It means you have a really long life. So you get a couple of benefits of long range. You get extra power, which is always fun for people, and you get long life.
But I guess, I understand that from the commute concept. But if I'm a contractor, I probably tow, or I probably have ladders on top of my truck, or I probably do other uses. That's why I have a truck. So how does that factor into building a brand of a truck like the Telo?
Yeah, so I'll talk.
Maybe Jason can talk about that a little bit, but he's interviewed construction folks, but it's really geared more towards the urban driver as opposed to the long haul towing. So we just don't believe long haul towing is something that an EV truck can accomplish, and so why go after that market? And if you're going to make a big long truck, you're kind of you're always going to be one down from the diesel Ram that can tow across the country with a fully loaded horse trailer, right? Like an electric truck is just not going to be able to do that.
Yeah, so if you look at the person that you're talking about, the contractor, the plumber, the electrician that does the work in the downtown city, more often than not, what they do is they live about 45 minutes to an hour and a half outside the city. They drive into the city, they spend the day in the city, and they drive their vehicle back. And we've interviewed a number of different general contractors, and one of the really interesting things that they say, especially in California, where they have to keep track of all their carbon emissions. So they've done analysis of all their carbon emissions over the duration of a project, the duration of a year. And you would think that the majority of carbon emissions comes from building supplies and transporting big objects long distances, or maybe the actual work going on, the generators being driven at the job sites, but actually 80% of their emissions come from their workers' vehicles. So these are workers that are driving to and from their job site every single day. They take their vehicles on the weekends to maybe pick their boat up and drop it off at their house, but they're not driving it hundreds and thousands of miles. That's actually really the use case that we see our vehicle for. The work that's being done in the city, the people that maybe live outside the city going into the city, then they require 250 plus miles to do that job almost every day.
So at this point, I'm going to freak out without asking a question about EV charging, because charging is such a critical part of what we're seeing in this transition. So the first question obviously is going to be, are you running those batteries at a 400 volt architecture or an 800 volt? And therefore, what kind of charging speed might we expect on the truck?
That's a great question. We are designing for both. We started focusing on 400 volts because that's actually what's existing. We've been in talks with various charge station makers, one of which I used to work for, and most of them coming online are supporting 800 volt. So we are looking at an architecture that would support that as well.
So
charging is we will be NACS native. That's our goal, and so part of that goal is to have the maximized charging speed, but the other part of that goal is to have a charging network that's not a dumpster fire.
Which then gives us something, 150 kilowatt capable charging, possibly higher?
Definitely higher. They can do up to 250, and then with their 800 volt architecture, they can do up to 350. Our battery pack isn't ginormous, but it's good sized. So we can expect charging times in the 20-minute range with those rates.
Yeah, that's going to be a huge part of the journey, because if you're dropping a 300 mile capable vehicle into the market with a 200 plus kilowatt capable charge, 20-minute charge times are going to get you around the country fairly comfortably for the kind of use cases you're imagining.
Yeah, and to be clear on the use cases thing, like a lot of the people that we've interviewed that are going to be our customers are charging at home. So they're using level 2, they're using wall chargers the majority of the time. And Forrest, who actually, I don't know if you guys are going to introduce him, but Forrest was the founder of PlugShare. So he has, out of anybody in the world that's worked on charging infrastructure, he has the most data on people that are actually utilizing these stations. And we see the opportunity for the urban commuter and the urban worker to be charging majority of the time either at job sites that have availability in charging or at home.
Yeah, so with PlugShare, your experience was all about building it from a beginning of the charging infrastructure in the US through to ultimately a very successful exit, I believe.
Yeah, when we started, there were only several hundred stations across the U.S. It's between 300 and 600 stations. We let people share their home as an additional place people could charge, and that increased the number of spots to about 5,000, pretty much overnight. That really helped us stay like relevant in the kind of data collection and understanding where all the stations were. And then we kind of created a score for scoring stations, and I still use that all the time because the score really varies depending on how people have succeeded at charging at that location. So it's a really good, um, you know, uh, it gives you a good idea of whether you'll actually succeed at charging. And right now, as more and more people are coming in line, there are some places that are getting crowded, overcrowded really quickly. Um, and so I think that's one of the biggest issues, frankly, to EV adoption, and maybe why it's kind of stalled out recently, is that, or the perception of that anyways, is that it's these charging stations that aren't NACS are really terrible to use.
And
Where are you guys on the journey? We've been talking a lot about future. You've talked about having multiple generations of batteries, so it doesn't sound like you're just starting. Where are you in the journey? Where is a Telo truck to be seen?
Yeah, so we have prototypes in our offices in San Carlos. We actually share a backyard with one of those early companies that started right next door to us. But so we have drivable vehicles downstairs, as well as stationary bucks that kind of define both the interior and exterior of our vehicle. We're currently building our gamma builds of our vehicle. These, I wouldn't call these full pre-production builds, but our battery pack, our safety systems, those are in place for these vehicles that you will be able to see. So there will be a big announcement next year, and everyone will get really excited about our vehicle showcased around the world. But you won't be able to see them driving on roads before then.
And how much of the technology in the truck is important? So, for example, we always talk a lot about our EV series. You know, Teslas have kind of got the lock or perception of the lock on the technology angle. How important is that for a new company emerging? And is that a differentiator, or is it off the shelf and being able to get into the price point in the right market more of a differentiator?
So I think that there's a differentiator in the market space. And one of the big differentiators we have in the market space is that we have an identified market that's unserved. We have this market of people that really want small trucks that aren't able to go out and go buy a small truck. And so they're just begging for them. And the way that they're solving those problems right now is they're either buying side-by-sides or low-speed vehicles or golf carts, or buying a big truck and just dealing with it, or maybe just going with a Prius and putting your 4x8 sheet of plywood and hanging out the back of your Prius. That's what we see in market identification. I think that's what really makes us unique in that sense. We have technological differentiators in our battery and our safety technology, and that's the area that we focus on. We're not trying to vertically integrate everything because that's a daunting task, and there may be a state in the future where we can do that. But what really enables us to go after this market are those two core USPs. And Forrest identified the battery one. And to summarize the battery one, we have a battery pack that's extremely volumetrically space efficient because of how we electrically and thermally connect it. Like, that's what makes our battery pack so unique. And Forrest is like, has the background, the expertise, has worked on battery packs since the 1990s on developing this for the electric vehicle craze. And so we are like really well established in what's capable and what's possible in that space. The other piece of the pie is on safety. And safety has a lot of different factors to it. We've seen a lot of vehicles over time as safety regulations change. People like add an extra 6 inches of bumper to that vehicle and make it look uglier and bigger. And that's like, we don't think that's the appropriate way to actually look at safety. When people actually do the hardcore engineering to actually validate crash safety systems on vehicles, they make a lot of assumptions, and those assumptions may not be true nowadays. So one of the big assumptions they make is if we measure the change in acceleration at the base of the vehicle platform, that has some correlation to the change in acceleration of the head and the heart of occupants. So what's really important here is that what really matters is the head and the heart of the occupants. That's where you need to measure from. So you truly need to be looking at the holistic science of the crash rather than just approximating it based on the acceleration on the vehicle platform. So we're able to not only pass crash safety, but pass crash safety with a good amount of margin without having this giant hood of our vehicle. On top of that, having a giant hood really makes it very difficult to see over that hood, and thus potentially hitting pedestrians, dogs, you name it. We're at an all-time high in pedestrian deaths in the US, approaching 10,000 pedestrians dying per year in the US. There's an incredible Economist article that came out this week on this topic specifically. But it's like, wow, have we got to the wrong space where maybe we've saved a few occupants in return for killing far more pedestrians?
And that's really interesting that you highlight that point, because it's something that on our smaller British and European roads we really noticed is you bring some of these vehicles over, and a lot of them, a small child, their head is well below the bonnet height. They did a fantastic test many years ago, people sitting in trucks and looking behind them, and you can't see anything behind you. So bringing vehicles big vehicles into a smaller urban environment is really challenging. So the work being done here is really important. Are you looking at things like the driver's seating position, the way they can visualize around the vehicle, the rear view, all that sort of stuff as well?
Absolutely. Like every time we build something in our vehicle, we pull in the model of the human and their eye ellipsis, and we look at where their eye ellipsis can see. And that's core to how you design the entire vehicle. So our downward vision angle will beat out any vehicle on the road today, for example.
And do you do that as physical models, or as you highlighted earlier, is this all done with computer simulation?
Both.
So we do it all 100% virtually, but we do have a seating buck that we built as well, just to make sure that we're not too crazy.
And our design firm, Fuse Project, has a seating buck and an interior buck, and so there is a lot of back and forth between the buck that's kind of foam core and plywood and seats and stuff, and how it feels, and then how is that matching up in cab?
And what I'm hearing, therefore, is you're kind of pushing the boundaries of vehicle design and how you tackle the challenges of meeting regulations and requirements. How's that journey been between pioneering a new approach to developing a vehicle, as well as also satisfying, fairly old school regulators in the way that, they classify safety, for example?
Yeah, I mean, it's nice that a lot of vehicles have come before us and have pushed on the regulators. So it seems like mostly regulators want to see EVs out there. We have experience in this field, so both Jason and I getting various systems passed, regulations and understanding them. But in addition to that, we also hire contractors who are experts in these spaces to kind of go over details, because it is important. So our next step after the vehicles we're building right now will be homologation, which is passing all the laws at once for the US.
And to be clear, we're not going to just start it after this phase. We've already started it in our last phase of our company and crashed our vehicle hundreds of times already. We know what's capable of doing from a change in acceleration perspective from a lot of the core components that we've integrated into our vehicle already. What's really important, though, is that regulations can oftentimes be working in the favor of keeping everybody safe and regulated, but they can also have unintended consequences, which I think is really unique, and especially talking about this space. So the regulations around the Environmental Protection Agency trying to encourage more fuel efficient vehicles are actually core to the reason that we have giant trucks in the US right now. So a quick story on that. In the 1970s, EPA was established to build more fuel efficient vehicles because we were in a gas crisis. They exempted all trucks, saying if you did work in a truck, you can do what you want because we need you to be doing work. We need the economy to work. But in 2010, we changed our regulations and brought in trucks to this story. But in doing so, we actually tried to have that same story of if you're doing work, you need to be able to continue doing work. So the thought process was if you were driving a bigger truck, things like a dump truck or a garbage truck or anything large, then you should have a little bit more leeway in your fuel economy regulations. And the thought process was good. It was like saying, okay, like you're carrying more weight, driving further range, you can get a little bit of leeway. But in reality, what happened was the automaker said, if I just make my vehicle a little bigger and call it that, then I can have a really great opportunity to pass these fuel regulations. So every single vehicle got a little bigger. And then the story here is that every single year, those regulations ratchet up. They get harder and harder and harder to hit. So every single year, the automaker goes, I need to build my vehicle a little bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger every year. And that's how we ended up in the space we are in today.
And we're the only country that has based those fuel economy mileage requirements on the footprint of the vehicle, to my knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, you look at Japan. You go to Japan, you see these small mini trucks everywhere. These K trucks, they call them, KEI trucks. And they're awesome, by the way, if you get a chance to go there. Um, the reason that those exist is because Japan did the opposite in their government regulations. They tax incentivized automakers to build these vehicles that fit in this tiny little footprint because they were realizing that they were taking up so much space in city streets. This is the only way that they could encourage that to happen. So that had the opposite effect.
All right, so we've covered policy, we've covered kind of the technology you're bringing, and you said we're expecting something next year, some sort of announcement. What's the future look like for Telo? Where are you guys going?
Well, the short-term future is that we think that every single F-150 in the city should be a Telo truck. Every single pickup truck in the city should be a Telo truck. There's a longer-term solution where we think every single vehicle in the world is 50% larger than it needs to be and burns 3 times as much as is 3 times as inefficient as it should be. So we see a future where every single vehicle, from the small passenger vehicle up through the Class 6 big trucks, should be 50% smaller.
Right. And you already talked about this, and just to recap, you suggested that most of your users will be charging at home. They're not likely to need charge stations added. So from what you said, charging's not really an issue?
I'll clarify that. I don't think most of our users will 100% of the time charge at home, but the majority of the time they are charging that will be at home. They will still use superchargers when they go down and want to go from San Francisco to Los Angeles, for example, core opportunity. But that's going to be the 1 to 5% of their time in their use case. And we have a lot of data to support that assertion.
So does the infrastructure we have today support your kind of growth without the additional need for charging infrastructure, from what you're saying?
The US needs way more charging infrastructure outright. And that's not just for us, but for the adoption of electrification holistically. So that's 100% the case. And I'm never going to argue that we're good enough as it is right now.
Just curious.
Yeah, and I'm a strong believer in the automakers, putting chargers in the ground, because it is the thing that enables the sale. And the only company that's done that you know of, and they've made the NACS standard, and their stations are by far the best. And it's because they needed to do that to actually sell the vehicles. And I think that's going to continue. And we've kind of seen that kind of stall off. I think it's a really difficult business model for people putting in charging stations. And so it needs to tie into the purchase of the vehicle, personally.
And there's a lot of reasons why an automaker is the right person to install charging networks. And a lot of it comes down to the financials of actually building a single charger. And if you're building vehicles and you build 100 vehicles to one charger, well, you can actually amortize costs significantly better than if you're just building chargers.
So a lot of what you guys are doing doesn't sound that cheap. And you've highlighted the idea that historically people used to believe that you need to raise $1 billion to be able to build an automotive manufacturer. How do you see your financial journey progressing? When will we see first units hit the market? When will you hit first revenue? And how are you going to fund that growth trajectory? And do you see yourselves as a volume manufacturer over time, or is this always going to be a smaller mid-play in the market?
No, we absolutely going to go big in the future. But part of the problem, the story you heard about people raising incredible amounts of money, has been that they've gone right to high volume manufacturing without proving out enough of the technology and processes in place to actually get there. So they just burn tons of capital making poor decisions that could have been ascertained with $100,000, but spent $100 million on them instead. Classic example is if you look towards high volume manufacturing for body panels of a vehicle. This is just a very simple example. You buy steel tools. Steel tools, the process of making steel tools that stamp in the ground. If you ever watch the movie 8 Mile, you'll see Eminem stamping the big tools. Those are giant steel tooling. They're massive, and they cost about, in total, $100 million worth of money to buy those tools. Now, there exists other processes and materials you can use for stamping sides of vehicles that you can do at 500 to 1,000 units per tool, and they cost $1 million. So the difference is 100x. But you can build 500 vehicles or 5,000 vehicles if you can clean up that tool every time that you spend 500, versus you can build 5 million vehicles. So if you look at high volume, you're like, of course, I'm going to buy the high volume tooling. But now you just committed $100 million. If you made a mistake, you have to go back and fix. That's another $100 million. Versus if I burned $1 million and I make a mistake and have to go fix it, probably a little easier to stomach that one.
Is there still regulation for the size of there used to be, if you're a small producer, you could get away with some different safety regulations and things like that. And so you also would hit a tipping point, I imagine, between your numbers when you kind of hit a point where you have different requirements.
There absolutely is, but we're not going to try to, maneuver around the market too much, because we feel like if you're going to bring a vehicle to market, it's got to be safe. So we're going to focus on making our vehicle as safe as possible from the get-go. Now, to just answer your question from the scientific perspective, if you build less than 2,500 vehicles, you're allowed to claim a hardship exemption. And when you claim a hardship exemption, you can actually say, hey, my vehicle maybe doesn't pass these certain regulations. You call them out specifically. It prints out to a sticker. It goes into the door frame of the vehicle. And you say, hey, just so you know, when you're buying this vehicle, we don't pass these regulations because it was too hard for us to do it.
That's a fascinating little journey you've got in terms of basically trying to hit profitability sooner than a volume produced vehicle. You've obviously got a lot of support in the experience of the other manufacturers that have gone before you. You've used digitization heavily to enable you to understand how you like you say, crash a vehicle 100 times without having to build 100 vehicles. What else can we expect in the future of this manufacturing evolution that will enable you to bring more than one vehicle type to market or extend the base or whatever? Where do you see the vehicle going and how you're manufacturing it over the next 10 years?
Well, one of the fantastic things we're looking at is we're looking at the classifications of different types of trucks and vehicles. And we're saying, what platform can we build? What core platform can we build that can address everything in this category? So right now we're a class 2 truck. So we can build a lot of things that exist within the class 2 platform. We're looking at 1, we're looking at 3, 4, 5, and 6 as well. How can we span over the entirety of the market and build a platform that works for all those different use cases? So that's really core to what we're doing. So this can become an SUV, a van, even maybe something a little bit more crazy if you get your minds going different ways. But that's really what we want to do. So our vehicle is kind of modular in that sense, even though the platform stays the same. Other thing that we're looking at really significantly is material science. So material science plays into both crash safety and making lightweighting / low costing a lot of our vehicle platform. There's a lot of really interesting stuff happening in that space that we're excited to talk about in the future.
There's also a fairly large kind of excess of capacity on the contract manufacturing side. So we are working with contract manufacturers that can make 5,000 vehicles a year or upwards of that. And so our plan currently is to go down that path of contract manufacturing because there seems to be so many options there.
Well, this is pretty exciting. I'm looking forward to seeing these and seeing them on the road. I can't wait to see one of your vehicles.
This is hugely exciting, and you've taken us on that journey through concept, experience, USPs into a world of how on earth you bring these kind of products to market. So it's been a real delight to have you guys on the show today. Thank you very much.
Thanks
for having us.
For our audience, we hope you're as excited about this content as we are. If you are, don't forget to subscribe. Join the conversation. Find us on the YouTube channel. Ask these guys questions about their content. Ask them. They'll follow up. And we'll see you again next time on the Insider's Guide to Energy. Bye for now.